Development Committee meeting, please. Okay, so we're going to go to the questions on 6A, and we'll start with Mr. Juarez.
Thank you, Chair. So I've listened to the presentation, and I'm not sure, and I even see your next steps, but I'm still not sure where our preference lies, because I sense the conflict that exists here, that we have an emerging class of IPOs and companies that are coming forward with these dual share structures, and yet they also, at least for the short term, appear to provide benefits beyond what the index or what their total composite of competitors might be. And so I'm still uncertain from your presentation if in fact at some point we may choose one side versus the other or not. And so again, I'm going to sort of put you to the task of telling the board, where do you think we're likely to end up on all of this?
You bet.
And so just put it to you. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, the tough questions. Well, I think number one, our principles and our advocacy around one share, one vote, we're not advocating, nor would we ever think there'd be a change in our approach to that. We do think that there will be some important changes that Anne underscored, either from a regulatory standpoint or from the stock exchanges, and certainly we're already seeing movement from the different types of offerings from index providers. But we're really watching what may or may not happen out of the regulators and the stock exchanges. So our biggest piece of advice is let's wait to see how that regulatory and exchange environment changes over the next year to 18 months is what we've said. And not force an answer to a question about changing our benchmark methodology until that debate has gone further, because there's enough changes that might be coming that would inform us, and it would be premature to call the ultimate question on whether or not our current benchmark methodology is the right one or not. So that's the second piece of our recommendation. And then thirdly, in terms of our global equity benchmark, we will review it in 2 years. That's the mid-year cycle that's referenced. And in our agenda materials, our actual written agenda memorandum, we say that at that point in time would be a time we could review in more detail whether or not it makes sense to screen our benchmark, and I'll use my words carefully, screen our benchmark or divest of shares of companies that meet some of these definitions. We don't think that now is the time to take up that question. We are posing for the committee whether or not that would be reviewed at our mid-year cycle or earlier, and that's a question for the committee. We're not recommending that we take it up earlier. We think it's something that would come naturally at the mid-cycle and gives us time for this regulatory and stock exchange work to go forward.
If I might, then I appreciate the answer and I appreciate the timeline. I would just, since I'm not likely to be here in 2 years, just to put it on the board, should put it on as a marker that when they come back, that we ask the question, we now have all that information, or presumably would have all the information we need to make a decision. I would hope that the decision, if the decision is to divest, that it's as difficult as the one that you had last month when it came to gun divestment, and that all the factors are fully taken into account. I mean, you always have to be careful when you make a statement that you don't get hoisted on your own petard. So I would just raise that as an issue, and then in 2 years, we'll see whether circumstances have changed. And so I would just encourage the board to stay on that, and in 2 years' time, we'll see whether it's worth taking action against these firms.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Juarez.
Thank you.
Ms. Mather?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just thank you for preparing this agenda item with such little time and so thoroughly. I really think this is a significant effort, and I really appreciate the responsiveness of the team. Secondly, I am encouraged by some of the developments in the marketplace. I think ideally it would be addressed by the marketplace more broadly and not be something that CalPERS has to make a decision about one way or the other. So hopefully things will evolve in such a way that support our one share, one vote view. And I'm prepared to be a little bit patient around that. I am, and I also appreciate that right now the way it looks, there's a premium in the early years of these companies, and then that deteriorates, and actually performance there's underperformance in the outer years. One thing that I'm concerned about is clearly the trend in dual class shares becoming more common in the marketplace. And yes, good that we're still haven't reached 80%. We still have 80% of shares being issued on a one share, one vote basis. But let's say the market moves to 30% of shares being dual class, or 40% or 50%. I would imagine that not all of those companies will be sort of the exceptional technology superstars with that outperform so early, and so the sort of this link between performance in the early years and dual class shares, I can envision that it could be really weakened if this becomes a more popular approach. So yes, watch and see, and hopefully the market will develop in such a way that will support our views, and we'll come back to it at an appropriate time. Thanks.
Okay. Ms. Yee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate this presentation and really the thoroughness of it as well. Had a couple questions that maybe could help us as we think about all of these considerations going forward, and that is, you talked about most of these companies being tech companies, and I was wondering if you could give us a breakdown of the sectors that are represented with respect to the dual vote companies.
I'm looking towards our global equity side of the desk.
Candidly, I don't have an exact
That's okay.
breakdown.
It can come back. It can come back.
Yeah, we can come back. I can tell you that the 3 of the 5 largest are tech companies.
Right.
So they're Google, Facebook,
Right.
and then Samsung. Then in there, you've also got Berkshire Hathaway and Visa. Those are the 5 largest. So, I mean, it is definitely tech dominated, and even U.S. tech dominated. But for more details, we'd have to come back.
Okay, that's great if you could provide that. And I think with the emphasis on tech companies, certainly I think the ongoing concerns that we have as a state with respect to the impacts of technology and how that will affect the changing nature of work, I just think it's essential that we as investors continue to have a vote and to be able to influence corporate governance of these companies going forward. And so I just want to put that down as a marker. With respect to the index providers, the 3 that you cited in slide 14, will there be, or have you seen any preliminary modeling that looks at what expected returns might be from the various approaches?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this may be a question more for Eric, but I'll just at a high level, when we talk about 30 basis points of what has been the last 10 years experience, the degree of uncertainty around our capital market assumptions are sufficiently broader than that. So it would be hard to come up with a sort of a differential prospective return expectation, with the only exception being that, again, knowing what the past is, but then also narrowing the universe, certainly through a quantitative investment management framework, narrowing the universe, can only result in, constraints on the optimizer can only result in a worse outcome. So, and for an active management standpoint, to narrow the universe not only narrows, what's in the benchmark, but then it also narrows the degrees of freedom that our active managers would have.
No, I understand that. Okay.
Anne Simpson, I'd like to add a point to what Dan said, which is the index providers are creating an incentive for companies to change their voting structure. So if we're stuck, between a rock and a hard place, missing out on the gains, for example, from the technology sector or fantastic performers like Berkshire Hathaway, or we don't have one share, one vote, and things go wrong in the future, and there's nothing we can do to, protect our interests as a share owner. By creating this economic incentive, my hope, and I think this is, let's see, I'm an optimist at heart, my hope is that company executives are largely rational individuals, and they want to see their companies succeed, and access to capital is part of that success. So to the extent we can help create that economic incentive, we're putting in place some incentives for companies to actually take the high road for governance, because it's also the high road for their access to capital. So my hope would be, just to add to Dan's point, that we see more companies deciding, wow, yes, I do want to be considered to be part of the S&P flagship indices. I've got a 5-year grace period. Let's see if we can start to unravel some of the dual class structure. So I think that's the one to watch for.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say both access to capital and cost of capital, to Ann's point,
Cost,
that both are critical components for a manager. And our hope would be, again, because as Ted said, we are settled. We believe in one share, one vote. Our hope would be to see actually some of this, reverse course.
So how are we currently dealing with dual class shares in our global equity benchmarking?
They're included in the portfolio. So
Okay.
that's the 10% that I referred to. About
Okay,
10%
so
of the portfolio has
just-
some differential voting rights.
Okay. I want to just express I agree with Ted in terms of really taking a wait-and-see approach, and I do hope that we have a robust review when we do the ALM mid-cycle. But I do have to say that just looking at our beliefs and what CalPERS has always stood for, the no-vote share model just really is bothersome to me. And I hope that we can have, and Mr. Chairman, I'd like to maybe just specifically agendize a discussion about the potential of excluding these companies from the index when we do have our ALM mid-cycle review, because I just don't see how that serves us. And I hope that just by our even taking that discrete matter seriously, that maybe we can send a signal with respect to our valuing the one vote, one
Yeah.
share.
I think that's consistent with the request, so
Okay,
similar to Mr. Juarez 2 years from now. Okay.
thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Ms. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you, Ted. I know this was short notice. I know I was kind of like, we got to have this, and I do appreciate it. It was very thorough. Thank you all very much for a really good report. I just wanted to clarify, you guys were talking about some of the sector that's represented. Google, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway are some of the stocks that are involved in the dual share, right? But Snap is Snap the only one that has no votes?
I think there's a few others.
There are a few others?
So in the past year or so, there have been 4 IPOs that have no voting structures. Snap is the only one that's actually issued them. So a couple of others came public with no voting structures, but what they actually issued to the market were dual class structures. So they were 10-to-1,
Okay.
10-to-1 supermajority vote.
Okay, so they're the only one that actually went to market
The only
with
one in the
no.
hands of investors currently. Now, as Ann mentioned, there are MLPs, so that's a different topic. But from a standpoint of companies that issued stock, the only one so far is Snap.
Okay, so, and I'm just going to ask this because I know that this company has had issues, which is Uber a dual share?
It's not publicly listed.
It's not
a
publicly
private
listed,
company.
okay. So I just want to make sure that we have an ability to have some, discussion when things go wrong. And it seems like in the short term, they make us a lot of money, and then that's not the case in the long term, and that's when we have issues with these companies. So I just want to make sure that, as Ms. G said, that we look at this at our ALM. I'm a little disappointed that we kind of got stuck with it and have to wait this long. But I would like to see, have a discussion about it, and agendizing it makes sense to me as well, so.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if you could comment on, in past meetings, we've talked about the dynamic of a reduced number of public companies versus companies staying private. Seems to me that no vote is just another version of being private. But so is this just another item in the list as companies consider it, or how big of an issue is this from the company side in terms of the shrinking universe of public companies versus one staying private?
Well, Ann has seen this discussion up close at the SEC Investor Advisory Commission. It is part of this capital formation question. Are there, I'll try and say this unbiasedly, not biased by our one vote, one share, or on the other side at all. Why is it that there are fewer IPOs than previously? And is it the array of regulations? Is it the growth of capital in the private markets and the ability to fund these companies for longer periods of time? There's lots of factors at play, but certainly the fact that there's a pronounced number of dual-class vote shares coming forward, particularly out of the tech sector, leads us to believe that it can be argued either way, that it's a nice outlet to have dual-class shares to allow some of the technology companies to come forward, or that the fracturing of the market is leading many not to even list. But Ann, you've had this debate.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Ted. The SEC's Investor Advisory Committee has been having hearings on a whole string of issues, and one of them was on one share, one vote. Another one has been on the incredible shrinking IPO market. And as Ted said, you can't isolate the corporate governance agenda from some other big economic factors, and one of them is, what are the public markets being used for? So, up until probably 25 years ago, companies were coming to market to raise money for the business. And now companies are coming to the market, and often the purpose is to monetize compensation for executives and to buy out the original or second round of venture capitalists. So, you've got that dynamic. Secondly, and this was a theme that came out in the hearings that we had, is that there is not a level playing field in terms of regulation with public and private markets. So the question of, for retail investors, the SEC chair is very concerned about this. Retail investors can't get access to all the economic potential that's in the private markets. We can be in there through our private equities asset class, but most people in the stock market can't get hold of that. So all that late stage venture capital growth is happening before or instead of an IPO. So some of it, I think, is economic, secular change in what do companies need money for. Secondly, you've got the fact they can stay private and have abundant access to capital if they want to stay away from the market. And then there's a whole series of regulatory changes which have imposed additional costs on companies and which the SEC is looking at because if red tape is there, it should be there for a reason. And if it is imposing unnecessary costs or barriers to companies, that needs to be removed. However, under the so-called Jobs Act, there was an attempt to remove a lot of reporting and costs, what was perhaps considered a burden at the time for companies as they came in, and really there hasn't been, that doesn't seem to have had a big impact. So that has left people scratching their heads and say, really, you said the costs and the regulation were the problem. We've now given you a sort of a glide path into the market without having to do all kinds of Sarbanes-Oxley style reporting, and that hasn't fixed it. So I think it is part of a bigger discussion, but we're very glad that the SEC is looking at it, and it's going to have a profound impact on many investors. Norges has published a discussion paper on this topic and saying, really, institutional investors, even if they're able to access private markets, need to put their heads together and start thinking about what's going on in the public markets, because this is not just affecting the US, it's affecting other markets as well. So there are big economic consequences not having a healthy flow of IPOs.
Is that report generally available? Yes,
the SEC website has sort of webinar section where you can pull up the hearings and the debate that we had. But the papers that were submitted, some of them were absolutely superb and gave a lot of data, and really, I think, have provided a lot of context to us. And I think helped us realize it's not as simple as saying, wow, you come to the market and suddenly the owners want to vote. Best to stay away. You know, we have heard that version of what's going on. That I think what's really helpful about these hearings is they've really just shown that we've got a much more complicated set of issues to deal with, and that's important to know. It's not a simple fix.
Okay, thank you.
And I would only add one thing is, and it's not only complicated, all of Anne's points are obviously spot on. It's even complicated by the size of the IPOs. And now you're finding that especially the small IPOs, you know, the companies like, you know, Oracle and Apple and Genentech that came public as really, really small companies, and yet public retail investors had access to them, that, you know, even the Facebooks and the Snaps of the world that come under these, you know, governance structures that we're not big fans of, even them, they wait until they're really big companies before they come. It's a concern.
Okay, thank you. So no further questions on that item. We move to 6B, proposed revisions to governance and sustainability principles.
Great. We're moving right along. So, Anne, 6B, I'm giving you a chance to shuffle your papers. Really, the point in 6B is we're going to take up some proposed policy new changes to our principles with respect to corporate culture and sexual harassment. And we have some proposed language that we're recommending. Now, this is an information item. If the committee gives us direction of comfort of that language, you'll see it next month and the following month in the form of the total fund policy, which includes these principles where you'd actually take action to accept it. In addition, there's a brief, there's a discussion of the treasurer's proposal on diversity that I think last month we didn't get a chance to speak to in specificity. So with that, Anne, I think the plan is for you to take it away from here.
Thank you very much, Ted. Anne Simpson, Sustainable Investments. As Ted says, we've got two pieces to discuss today that we've put forwards, but I do want to acknowledge that when we restructured the principles, we put them into 5 what we call core issues: investor rights, board quality, compensation, reporting, regulatory effectiveness. So we've worked our way down the to-do list that came out of that review, and we've also responded as time's gone by to particular issues that have been raised with us. So I just want to emphasize this is a very good example of a living document, something that we expect to respond to what's going on, but also which responds to things that we learn. We learn from experience, we learn by doing. So we welcome the board's suggestions and input from stakeholders, and also what comes through our own engagement with companies as well. So with that, just as a reminder, this is we're not writing a section of the Old Testament. This is something that guides us on a daily basis for company engagement, for regulatory advocacy, for talking to companies and talking to our managers. It's a guide. It doesn't substitute for judgment, because any particular situation you've got to weigh a lot of things out. But really, these are our guiding principles, and overseen and belong to the board. It's, overseen by and belong to the board. So thank you. I think on the staff front, we were very glad to have the issue of harassment raised at the last meeting. I think all of us have been watching with horror at the revelations that have been coming out. And also, we can see the impact on the companies that we invest in. I mean, share price is collapsing and reputation is destroyed. So this is something where you have got a perfect example of where ethics and money really do combine. This is an important issue. We were also very glad that the Council of Institutional Investors, as so often, has been absolutely on this and produced for members last month a very thoughtful guide, and we've included the whole document in your materials so you can see the quality of the analysis. So we really felt that we could draw upon not just it's a short period to look at a big topic since it was raised at the last board meeting, but we really felt we had something very thorough that we could draw from. Now, we didn't just copy and paste from that document. Much as we love CII, we went through the usual process of taking ideas and debate through our research working group, and then circulating to the subcommittee of the investment strategy group, the governance and sustainability subcommittee. So we've had a lot of involvement from all the asset classes and a lot of helpful input from our legal office as well, which we're very grateful for. The upshot is we have two proposals on this topic and are seeking the investment committee's review. An improvement, in all humility. So the first section that we think could really be improved is our section on board quality. Board responsibilities. What do we want to hold boards accountable for doing on our behalf as the owners of the company? And we've drafted some language, which I'll take you through in a moment. But we also think that this issue of harassment, and it could be sexual harassment, it could be on all manner of other possible topics. So we're using sexual harassment as the example, but there are other possible areas. We think it's important that this goes into our section on human capital management. In other words, once a company's policies and practices are being implemented, what should we be looking for on management? So I won't read this all out because you've had a chance to look at the language, but I just want to highlight a couple of points which I think are significant and I think reflect the way that CalPERS approaches this issue. And we have gone further than the CII on some issues. Rather than just asking a question of a board, we actually want something to be taken up because we think it is going to protect us from the risks of this sort of conduct, destroying company reputation and thereby, among other things, affecting our returns. So the section that we're suggesting is that we include something called corporate culture. And it's funny when something new gets brought to your attention, you look and say, well, how is it we didn't have that before? Well, we didn't. But of course, we all know that the culture of any organisation is what underpins its ability to perform, whether it's in public service or in the private sector or making returns. So I think it's a really welcome opportunity to include this new section. And we've highlighted that we want the board to have an active role in setting a high-performance culture. In other words, we're not accepting that this is just something for the chief executive and the senior executives. Of course, they'll implement, but we want the board to step up and accept it's a responsibility. And we're giving examples of what it would include. It's not exhaustive, but it's diversity, inclusion, also innovation, very important, and to ensure the workplace is free from sexual harassment and, very important, other forms of harassment. And we highlight the importance of fostering trust between employees and management and promoting ownership and accountability for an ethical corporation. So that's the overriding vision that we have for corporate culture on this point. Then what we've done is say specifically what would that look like if a company took this up. And we followed what we're finding to be quite a good structure for a whole range of different topics. For example, climate change is the most recent example. How do we know that a company has actually picked an issue up in the right way? So the first thing makes sense. The board should develop and disclose its efforts, including policy, but also the mechanisms through which the board learns about employee complaints, and also how claims are addressed. And the next point is very important. We're saying CalPERS supports voluntary arbitration in company policies. And I think some of you may have seen the Financial Times did a very nice survey on the issue of sexual harassment and posing the question, well, why is it so hard to find out what's going on? And their observation is that because many companies have mandatory arbitration, forced arbitration, settlements don't see the light of day. Now, unless they're required because they're material to be disclosed under a regulatory provision. And Microsoft was cited as an example of a company which had gone to a voluntary arbitration. So, of course, we would say if there's a way to settle through arbitration, both sides accept that that's a good way to go forward. So you're avoiding all the costs and conflict and aggravation of a court case, and you can settle, but both sides agree, and that's a good thing. So we're not saying arbitration shouldn't be used. It's just simply it shouldn't be something forced on employees. But I do want to flag that because it's something we talked quite a lot about, on the research team and the GSS. The second flows, of course, from the opening points in the language, is what do we mean by board oversight? So we're giving examples. We're saying we want the board to have oversight of the policies, the practices, and executive responsibilities. That means actually making sure, I would suggest, that this sort of thing goes into performance plans and duty statements and all the different arrangements that ensure that the executives of any organisation are in line with the board's expectations on ethical behaviour. And specifically, we're saying board oversight should be around, in all its dimensions, implementation of the effective corporate culture, which above we've explained a little what we mean by that. And finally, I want to highlight something we've introduced in the disclosure section because, again, it's significant. We're saying that companies should ensure that all settlements are reported to the board. And remember, if we don't have mandatory arbitration and all settlements go to the board, we think this is necessary for the board to be able to exercise effective oversight. They don't know what's going on and they're not getting the flow of information. Very hard for them to do that job well. We do acknowledge that, for example, the SEC in the United States requires disclosure of material settlements of any sort, which would include sexual harassment, but for a settlement to rise to the level of materiality as understood, as defined by the issuer, could mean that a lot is not being tracked by the board. So what we're saying here is that CalPERS supports the disclosure of settlements, including those on sexual harassment, where, and this is important, they involve an executive or a board member. So in other words, it's management's responsibility to deal with settlements throughout the employee structure. We think all of that should go to the board, so the board can oversee and understand patterns and track properly what's happening. But we think as an owner of the company, if settlements are made and they involve executives or board members, that's something we would like to know about. So I'd be happy to take any questions on this or move quickly on to the next section.
Why don't you complete your
just
presentation
finish this
first?
piece, yes. So apologies for, well, not apologies, it's an important issue and we've put a lot of thought into it, so I hope that's a helpful explanation. The next area, and I think this is where our board president initially suggested we look for including language. We agree. We think that the section on human capital management practices is absolutely the right place to make specific reference on harassment of any kind, including sexual harassment. So what we're suggesting here is we call this out. I think it's implicit in what we've already got, but of course what it also does is tie it into some language further below, which says boards should be accountable to develop and implement policies, procedures, but note also training and internal reporting structures to ensure they can fulfill. So I think it puts some extra specificity around, okay, well, you can say you're concerned about this, but what would it look like if the company was really introducing a full-blown program? And I think training is obviously a very important part of that, as we know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the report, and I just would like to reiterate what Mr. Eliopoulos indicated earlier, that this is an information item, that it'll come back next month as a first reading, so you have another bite at the apple. And then the following month, we will be looking at a second reading for a final vote. So there's plenty of time to voice your concerns or opinions. So with that, Mr. Juarez.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Wanted just, and this is really in line with the fact that we'll get another bite at the apple, as you say. For hopefully next month, what the Treasurer is hoping we can have is a robust discussion about his original proposal. We've been the recipients of both the analysis that was done here, as well as some other information regarding that particular proposal and why it may not be as logical and as fitting for the board to adopt as we might otherwise hope. And so what we're hoping is that when you come back in May, that we can engage you in a robust discussion about some other alternatives that would increase the transparency related to how we deal with companies who are not making significant progress toward diversity on their boards, both in terms of gender as well as ethnicity, and hopefully taking those issues forward, we can come up with what we believe would be a reasonable approach to take if, in fact, quotas is not the right way to approach it. So I'm hoping that with all that said, that the Treasurer would be indulged to have a more robust conversation at that point.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Mr. Eliopoulos?
Sure, yeah. And in all cases, it's always helpful to have any suggestions or ideas ahead of time and in writing if possible. Because
And on that score, we will provide you something before the next meeting.
Great.
Thank you. We did, thank you very much for the letter in November. That's greatly appreciated, because I think CalPERS, like many other investors, is right at that point of saying, we have the evidence that diversity really makes a difference on risk management. We've got some very good insight into how it's good for performance in terms of improving returns. So what on earth is holding back the progress with the companies? And I think the studies that are coming through, one at the end of December that Spencer Stewart provided, gave us a clue. One is that companies are not opening up board seats. The retirement ages are going up, and companies are also removing retirement ages. So that puts a focus, we think, probably on the issue of tenure. Now, we did last year introduce the notion of 12 years being, it's not that you have faded from glory, but that your independence might well be in question. So we have got, and Samisa will talk more about this in a moment, we are thinking that we've got to continue the march on majority voting, because if we can't vote against directors, which is the case with many of the companies where they are diversity-free zones on the board, but we can't vote on directors to vote them out, or we don't have proxy access, so we can't put alternative candidates forwards. We've got both hands tied, maybe one leg too. We can't do much. So we've got to get those governance rights in place before we can then effectively engage. However, and I think we did put a bit of discussion on this in the memo itself, to say CalPERS' current definition of diversity is all-encompassing, and I think that's absolutely the right way to be. The second thing is, we're not limiting the goal, whether we call it a quota or a target. We're not saying boards should have this percentage of this category of director or that percentage. And I think that what the principle is based on is this idea that we want boards to access all the talent that's represented in society, in their workforce, in their markets. And we may well find, if that's the case, that 30% is not, as Mr. Juarez, I think we were saying at the last meeting, this may be a poverty of ambition. And I just, one data point that I want to share with the investment committee is, we were really pleased to see in December Spencer Stewart's annual survey of new board appointments. They were tracking the S&P 500, which is, of course, the biggest companies. They're the leaders. They're the ones that set the pace. For the first time ever, they were able to report that a majority of new board appointments were women and people of color. And that is, to me, the sign that the investor voice is being heard, but also that companies are getting it on the business case. Now, that is a leading indicator. It's not getting us to where we want to be. But I think that, with some of the other initiatives, which Samiso mentioned last month, we are in a position to actually build out a really robust plan. And at the moment, we've got, as we highlighted in this agenda item, some very specific things that we're going to be doing. And I don't know, Samiso, if you'd like to run through those three areas as the basis
if I
for our
could, before
strategy.
Tamiko goes, I just would say we're as much interested in the aggregate as you said, and it's good news to hear that, in fact, in general, that the board assignments are both reflect both gender and ethnic diversity. But I do think that we also want to look at progress of individual companies, and that's where I think the treasurer has held out some concerns in talking to other investors as to whether or not certain companies are even moving the needle at all. And to the extent they're not, should we be taking a specific approach or proxy toward them?
Yes.
And so anyway, but
Samiso.
Thank you, Anne. Samiso Nzima, Investment Director, Global Equity. As discussed in the March IC, staff really spent considerable time in terms of trying to determine what action plan to try and progress the issue of corporate board diversity. And as listed in the memo, really, we have a three-pronged approach in terms of trying to effect this. And the first approach really is really voting against any combination of board chairs, nominating and governance committee members, as well as long tenured directors. And as Anne correctly pointed out, really the issue of board refreshment and people staying on boards for a long term is one of those obstacles in terms of trying to improve on board diversity. So we're going to be, this is something which we're doing in this current proxy season, where we're actually voting against these following the engagements that we started in July last year. The second thing that we're going to do, again, in terms of the governance framework, and I think this is something which the board president raised last time around the issue of majority vote, that if you don't have majority vote, do you then have the ability to sort of move directors off the board and create that opportunity for board refreshment, that your vote that you're actually casting has teeth. So starting this fall, we are actually going to be writing to companies that lack diversity, that lack the broad sense of diversity, and that also do not have majority vote, asking them to adopt majority vote, failure to which we're actually going to be filing proposals at those companies. So this is something which really, really matters to us. We want to put some teeth around the issue of voting on this diversity initiative. And the third thing that we're really looking at is around coalition building. And we are really lucky we have, we've just done the Climate Action 100, the global coalition, which Anne Simpson here helped, put together that with the team. So we have sort of this in-house expertise in building coalitions, and we want to try and sort of use the same model in terms of looking at the issue of board diversity. We'll be working with other, asset owners and asset managers in terms of trying to see whether we can come up with a market approach, which is a market consensus in terms of how can we get companies to actually increase their board diversity, again, based on the broader definition of diversity. And at this point, I'll pause and take any questions.
Okay, we still have some questions. Mrs. Mather.
Thank you. Well, first of all, again, I know I raised this last month, and your response has been, the team's response is exceptional. I'm really pleased with this language. It clearly took a lot of thought and really addresses, I think, the two important dimensions. One is the board's role in establishing a corporate culture that is has zero tolerance for harassment, and then also sort of on the human capital management practices side, incorporating that more fulsomely. So I'm really pleased with the work, and I just want to say thank you for that. And it's it might seem like to some, like it's an ancillary issue, but in today's world, and Forbes and others have reported this, 80% of a company's assets are intangible, and that largely is brand. Sometimes it's IP, et cetera, intellectual property, et cetera, but a significant portion of that is brand. And we have seen companies lose significant value as a result of crises around sexual harassment. So I think it is essential that this be managed effectively by corporate boards and corporate executives. So this goes a long way to getting us there, and to getting us to helping us to guide these companies as we can moving forward. So I'm really, really pleased with that. And thank you also, Smiso, for sort of expanding on your approach around diversity, because I do think those two elements of focusing on the majority vote component, which is good for us on a number of issues. It's not just with respect to diversity, but with respect to other issues that we also think are key to corporate value, as well as the collaboration component, which I think only makes us more effective. So appreciate the continued focus on that and the expansion of the work. Thank you.
Ms. Taylor?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I too want to echo Ms. Mother and say this, we asked for this last month, well, she asked for it last month, and you guys produced an amazing report, and I really appreciate it. I like the language I'm seeing here. I also echo that I'm looking very forward to working with others to implement this. But I just wanted to say that I think this is an amazing report. I like the language. I had one question on where'd it go? There it is. So the voluntary arbitration, and then the following language in the following paragraph that talks about CalPERS supports the disclosure of settlements, including those on sexual harassment involving an executive or member of the board, to be disclosed. My only concern, I'm glad we're going to voluntary arbitration, but my only concern is the disclosure, if they go to arbitration, if they decide to go to arbitration, right, can there still be a clause that the person accepts that precludes it from being disclosed? You know what I'm saying? So are we opening a door for the employer to still hurt the harassed person? Yeah.
Do you mean what gets called a gagging clause?
Right.
So you end up in violation of some other part of your contract? It's. I think it's something we'd want to talk to our legal office colleagues about, because this is all very sensitive about rights under contract, rights to privacy, regulatory requirements on disclosure of material settlements. So we want to make sure we're striking the right balance here.
The material is very, I mean, it's just, material can be very large, right, most of the time. So if it's $1 million or $150,000, that's not going to be material enough to disclose.
And that's really why we're talking about settlements rather than simply supporting the materiality definition, because what's material to a company will be very different to what's material to an individual.
Right.
And also what we want as a very long-term owner is insight into the standard of ethics in a company. And if you find that there is a cluster of perhaps very small settlements around an executive or attached to a board member, it poses a real question about that leadership. And then we're in a position, having got majority voting introduced everywhere that we need it, to hold that board accountable. So I think we come across this definition of materiality in other settings as well, like climate change.
Right.
We've really, with the regulators and others, wanted to hold the line and say it's in the eye of the beholder. Materiality is like beauty. What's material to CalPERS over generations, over our portfolio, may look different to what is considered material by a company. And at the moment, it's in their gift to define it. But, there is a High Court, Supreme Court case in the US which defends the idea that the investor decides what's material. And I think that's something we really need to hold on to, not just for this type of issue around human capital management, but as I said, we run into the same thing with issues like climate change.
Thank you, Anna. And I also really want to tell you that I really like the language about the promoting diversity, inclusion, innovation, fostering trust between employees, management, promoting ownership and accountability for an ethical corporation, because as I think about these corporations such as Wynn that lost so much money, or the Weinstein Company, there would have to have been, I would assume, some sort of culture around this. I believe that's still going on in, I'm just going to not say the corporation right now, but in another corporation that has the same kind of culture. And I think that if we have this language and we're promoting this and we are using our proxy voting and our engagement, that we can maybe help bring to light this corporate culture that allows this kind of harassment or lack of diversity or wherever we're engaging at that point. So thank you.
Ms. Yee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very appreciative of the work here. I did have something I wanted to put out for consideration when this comes back. On page 15 of attachment 3, where the new language is added regarding corporate culture, is there a way to tie the disclosure section of this language to page 26 relative to the clawback policy to ensure that the settlement affects executive compensation?
Thank you for making that point. I think we should come back to you with some language, but
Okay.
it seems to me to be absolutely the right connection,
Right.
especially now that we've expanded the clawback language.
Right.
And thank you.
Thank you for responding to the part letter.
No,
Yes.
to understand that earning that bonus is contingent on not doing harm, not doing damage. And however you may have hit those numbers financially, this is an aspect of potential damage to the company because you've not been respectful with your employees. That seems to me absolutely the right point. So
Great. Thank you.
we can follow up with that.
Okay, Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So since Controller Yee raised the issue of clawbacks, so that gets into the area of compensation. And last month, we had a information item on this, and it was on the say on pay part. And again, this is for next month. I'm suggesting this would be, I think, hopefully a topic of conversation, that the Glass-Lewis grading system that we've decided that D and F we vote against. If it's A, B, or C, under certain conditions we might vote against, but when my kids are now grown, I do recall that when they brought home their grades, if they had an A or B, life was pretty good. If they had a C, it was time for intervention. So I'd like us to consider maybe some further board direction in this category on if they're rated C, should that be a no vote? So again, another topic to add to the conversation next month.
I guess we'll request investment, direction. I think one of the disciplines we tried to put in place, and this isn't directed to this question in particular, is that we tried to get all of the possible topics to take up so that we could have a discussion in March. We've added 2 discussions, one on diversity, one on corporate culture, for this month, really heading into trying to get the precise language ready for the total fund policy to be debated and discussed. So the number and different types of topics that are now being teed up for discussion in May and June is just going to prolong, it's messier than what we collectively as a board and staff had set out at the onset.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to try and get these topics, discussed and resolved. I think on this one, just in one final piece, we have not included this notion of, inserting, a third party like Glass Lewis's ratings into our principles. Right. That's just one piece of information that our professional staff uses to vote our proxies.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that the wording go into the policy. I think that's much too lower detail level, but I do think that we should have a conversation about how comfortable we are with the, under this policy, what you're then implementing when it comes to that particular area of decision, and whether in fact we want to consider some more direction, but not as a modification to the policy.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think that's important because as Ann and Ted will tell you, that when this document was developed, it was out of the outgrowth of every month wanting to make changes to it, and so we had to say, let's step back, and we set up a subcommittee of the committee to go and spend 5 to 6 months to come to this place. And so what we don't want to do is go back into this every month changing the document. So, but certainly it's for discussion purposes, but not necessarily every month changing the document.
Sure.
So we need more time to let that play out. So, okay. Mr. Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the work you all did bringing back with committee direction, the language. I just have a couple concerns. And a little bit along the lines of what one of my fellow board members said. Settlements, by their very nature, admit no wrongdoing by either party. I mean, I've heard thrown around, protect this person, protect that person. The issue is typically settlements. There is no admission of liability on either side. It is oftentimes, and you see this in green mail litigation, certain types of ADA lawsuits, that you enter in a settlement, you can either fix the problem or you make a cash settlement. So I'm a little concerned when we talk about wordsmithing that, first of all, any settlement implies wrongdoing, which then leads back to the question, if in fact the settlement is a result of wrongdoing and we are using language that says workplace free of sexual harassment, how do you allow a settlement to occur if the underlying issue that's reported to the board derives from sexual harassment? I just want to make sure, because we're wordsmithing here. The language we're using is respectful treatment of employees, efforts to promote diversity, inclusion, and innovation, providing a workplace free of sexual harassment. So we set that as the standard. It must be free of sexual harassment. Then we say, including those involving require disclosure of material settlements. We still have to define, I think the issue is, what's the word material? Is it $1? Is it $1 million? So where are the definitions for this? And I look back at the CII materials. And then it says, including those involving sexual harassment. CalPERS supports settlements, including sexual harassment, involving disclosure involving an executive or member of the board. So the presumption is, I'm just trying to reconcile, because we're supposed to have a zero tolerance policy, is if in fact you have a settlement related to sexual harassment that then disclosed to the board, is that employee is presumed to be still a member of the board or working there? So it's either zero tolerance for sexual harassment, settlement for sexual harassment, or we've just had a settlement. So I'm just trying to get to what the end game is.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. The model, the governance model that this reflects is that the board oversees management, and then management has responsibility for implementing the policy. So that would say the chief executive, for example, has the responsibility for her or his executives to roll out the zero tolerance policy. And the way that the board checks if the chief executive is doing her job properly or his job properly is by having a flow of information. And then the board says our policy is zero tolerance, and has the flow of information to say this chief executive is not implementing our policy. So that's the flow of information. The second question that you raise about the definition of materiality, that here is in the context of the regulators. So how it's approached in the United States, defined by the SEC, the materiality under, for example, US GAAP, set by FASB, is somewhat different to how it's set under IFRS, which is the International Accounting Standards Boards, where the regulatory bodies in other markets. So we did originally have some language that we thought about referencing the SEC in particular, and then thought, well, that's not going to work for a global portfolio. So we substituted financial reporting standard setters generally, because in a few places they don't, require disclosure of material settlements, and that would capture, but the materiality definition will be market specific. Yeah, and then we are proposing, and it's a very helpful discussion, we are proposing that due to the significance of their impact on the company as leaders, if an executive or a board member goes into a settlement, that is a piece of information that should be disclosed to shareholders. But it's something that could not be enforced.
I just want to make sure I understand.
A regulator couldn't enforce that.
What CalPERS policy is.
We're requesting
If a
that
CEO,
information.
so underneath the CEO, if you have a zero tolerance policy,
Yeah.
and short of zero tolerance, that a harasser is allowed to continue to work after a settlement agreement, that's to be reported to the CEO, who then reports that to the board. And if the CEO continues to allow that employee who has entered into a settlement agreement, and I'm just saying admitting to the sexual harassment, we're not even just talking about a standard settlement agreement, it'd be our position that that CEO should be terminated as a zero tolerance policy?
We're not reaching in over the board into the management responsibility. We want the board to oversee management and for the board to have a flow of information that's going to enable them to hold management accountable.
But under that scenario, I'm sorry.
If it can be improved, we'd be glad to improve it.
Under that scenario,
it's flawed.
That's not providing a workplace free of sexual harassment.
But the workplace free of sexual harassment is going to be achieved by the executives and the board's role, and we hold the board accountable. The board is there to make sure, and they can't do that unless they have a flow of information. And at the moment, I think it's quite unusual for boards to get that level of detail about what's going on with sexual harassment.
And I'm sure, as you understand, I know this issue on the state side inside and out. I mean, as the board I sit on, we deal with sexual harassment all the time. I know what the state policy is. In fact, as you will have probably recently read in the paper, the governor has convened a task force because we've had an issue relating to how sexual harassment cases and settlements were handled, who is actually responsible. I mean, when you talk about the fact that the state was settling cases and whether an agency secretary, department director, CalHR, SPB were signing off on this, is we're not a party. I mean, this is part of it, is we are not a party to the underlying litigation or the underlying complaint. And so I'm saying is, first of all, I believe it's a zero tolerance policy, right? And if you're settling a case that actually has underlying facts related to sexual harassment, what I'm more wanting to know is what happened to the employee that did it? Are they still employed? How did they take corrective actions? This doesn't necessarily change the behavior. This just means, and I'm not picking on you, Ted, but Ted did something wrong. He works for a private company. He still stays in, and we paid out $1 million settlement, and that's reported. What I don't see in this policy is that's why I just asked the pointed question about holding the CEO accountable.
Yep.
If the policy is it's a work-free place environment, I'm not as concerned about the settlement as I am about getting rid of the bad person.
Right.
And I don't want us to create a clutch that I've just created a new report. The Weinstein is a prime example.
Yep.
The argument could have been, we could have reported every settlement. He could have still been there.
Yeah.
How does that accomplish the policy goal of creating a workplace-free environment, even if they just report it all, or the win matter? I understand the exact same thing. Again, the difficulty I have on this, and there's just a little bit of the lawyer in me, is I don't like Mr. Wynn. I read the same articles. The question is, we haven't had a trier of fact or an arbitrator make a determination that anything happened. You had an allegation and you had a payment. That's really, I know it's the emotions around it, and those are sometimes difficult to peel back. Should that have been reported? But then the question really becomes, just to carry it out, is I now as a board member have knowledge, because of the settlement, that Ted has engaged in sorry, Ted, just pointing at you.
Someone.
Someone. Someone over there.
Yeah, right.
Someone over there.
Please, like to use a
someone
different
over there
example.
engaged in sexual harassment. So now what happens to me as the board member? Because now I have knowledge, because I've signed off. You've reported it to me. So what's my duty? That's all I'm trying to get at is you're imputing in me that I now knew what the settlement was, I knew what the terms of the settlement was, I knew what the allegations were, but I've never been the trier of fact. I've actually never heard the case, never heard the matter. What I'm asking to be done is approve matter X based upon two parties who were represented who came forth with an agreement. Or am I missing something? And I understand the policy goal we're trying to get at, which is get rid of the harassers, clean up the culture.
Right.
I'm not sure this actually accomplishes that goal. More transparency, more disclosure is important, but I am concerned about you're asking me as a board member, now I'm imputed knowledge because every settlement that comes in front of me now begs the question, even if the parties agreed not to disclose what the underlying facts were. Is that correct?
So the place, and thank you, because these are really important points, and I couldn't agree more to our president's comment that this has such wide effects on a company's ability to recruit, to retain, to motivate employees. The place where I think the issue you're raising, Mr. Costigan, is referenced, and maybe we can improve on it, and we're very open to your thoughts, where we say one policy, and we come to line 4, the sentence which goes, and the mechanisms through which the board learns about employee complaints. So, to your point, this is the flow of information. And then the second part says, and how the claims are addressed. Now, we could put something more explicit there, for example, and consequences. In other words, so the board knows if somebody's been disciplined, if they've been sent to training, whether they've lost their job.
Ms. Simpson?
Yes.
I'm going to ask that you've heard the concerns, and when you go back, because we got 2 more bites at the apple.
I'm sorry, yes, we have.
And I just don't think we should wordsmith here at the meeting. So you've heard his concerns, and take them back and come back to your views on response to his concerns, and we'll deal with it next month, okay? Okay, thank you. Ms. Yee.
And just a quick comment. Mr. Slayton brought up the issue of executive compensation, and not with respect to this policy, but I was ready to raise it for the next item, and if we could have a little bit more time to just talk through how we might want to proceed on the executive compensation issue in the next item rather than here. I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
No. I'll raise it on the next time.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you about it.
That's okay.
Okay.
I just didn't want the truncated conversation about executive compensation that Mr. Slayton brought up to be concluded with just his comments, that I was going to raise it additionally for the next item as well.
Okay. Okay, so this item 6B, I understand Mr. Steve Silverstein, you had signed up for 6C, but I understand you wanted to talk on 6B. Is that correct, Mr. Silverstein? Oh, it is? Okay, someone told me. Okay, all right. Good. Okay, then so that concludes the discussion there. Then we will move to item 6C, corporate governance update.
Okay, this will be turning over to Samiso, and I think Samiso is yours to take. Yep.
Thank you, Ted. Samiso Nzima, Investment Director, Global Equities. Really, this agenda item provides additional details around our shareowner campaigns. The March IC, we talked about some of the shareowner campaigns around proxy access, majority vote, and climate risk reporting. What we're providing under this agenda item really is to show the actions that we're undertaking to support those shareowner campaigns associated really with proxy solicitations, which is the teeth really, following our back on these other issues that we're trying to address. And as a reminder to the board, really, we run proxy solicitations for proposals that are filed either by ourselves or that are filed by others, but on issues that CalPERS care about, issues that are of priority to us, for example, board diversity and so forth. And what we have here, we've actually listed a total of 55 solicitations, really compared to 33 last year. This is in the agenda memo that you have, and the numbers, while they are set, at 55 right now, that number really is going to change because as companies settle, that number could actually come down. But on the other hand, we still retain the flexibility to run additional solicitations which are not listed here. So one example, as I was talking about this, last week we filed to run a solicitation at a company around the issue of board diversity. So this was a company which we had engaged. They didn't respond to our engagement on the issue of board diversity, and a different entity filed a proposal on the issue of board diversity policy, and we're running that solicitation for them. So again, so these numbers are not set in stone. They are going to change, potentially increase again, depending on the issues and proposals that are out there. Just the highlight on page 2 of 3, just to show that for majority vote, proposals, even though right now we're showing a number of 24 proxy solicitations, that number is likely to go down. For example, last year, we ended up not running any proxy solicitations around the issue of majority vote because the companies that were targeted settled with us, and then we didn't have to run any solicitations. And on proxy access, that's part of the work that we are doing, helping out the New York City funds in the Board Accountability Project. We've done this for a number of years where we have, they've created or targeted a number of companies on proxy access, companies that are selected based on board diversity, climate risk, executive composition, and other governance provisions. And we have run solicitations on those. And so we expect to be running about 16 this year. And then on climate risk reporting, right now we expect to be running about 14. Last year we ran 14 proxy solicitations, and that's sort of the same number, unless if some of those are actually withdrawn. That really concludes this agenda item, and we'll take any questions.
Okay, Ms. Taylor?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a quick question. So on the 14 climate risk, is that who I may have lost place while you were talking, is that who you were talking about that you were engaging with the New York funds? Was that the part of it, or was it above that, the one above that?
The proxy access are the one that we're actually working with New York City funds. We've done this, historically.
The first one, proxy access.
The first one, yes.
Okay.
The climate risk is different filers. Just like we did last year, we just helped in terms of running solicitations on 2-degree scenarios climate risk reporting proposals. So it's specific to 2-degree scenarios.
Are we engaging with STIRS, as well on this?
Not on, not specifically on climate risk, but we talk to CalSTARS in terms of some of the activities that they're doing. Especially, we've worked together on board diversity, just to find out what they are doing in that space, and that's something which we're looking at. If they file anything on on diversity policy, that's something we'll work with them in terms of running solicitations on that issue.
So finding out and working with sound like two different things. I'm a little confused. Are you saying that we actually do work with STIRS on a number of issues?
We have. So for example, we work with them on the California, the board diversity project involving California companies. This is something we've worked with them, I think, starting in 2014 or 2015, where we've engaged collaboratively California companies that lack gender diversity. That was really specific to gender diversity.
Okay, so,
Yes.
but we don't So on gender diversity, board diversity, we are engaging with STIRS. On climate, it's the New York Fund. Have we thought about bringing a bunch of the funds together on a lot of these proxy issues? Climate, diversity, anything? Because these are pretty big issues, right? I would think that having a couple of $1 trillion worth of money would make a big difference. And I was just wondering if we were working in that, going that direction.
That is something, thank you for that. That actually is something that we're looking at. When we spoke about the diversity initiative and building coalitions and talking about really modeling some of the coalitions on the Climate Action 100, which we are working with, a larger group of investors, that's something which we're looking at. And with specific to the climate risk reporting proposals, we have weekly calls which are organized by series under the carbon asset risk campaign. So we're actually participants on a weekly basis on those calls, and this is where we've actually made that indication that we'll support and run proxy solicitations really based on every participant on those series organized calls.
Okay, great. And then one other question. These proxy, are these letters, the 16, 14, 24, are they engagements? I don't know if it was both or if it was one or the other.
So the proxy solicitation, so I'll just do sort of maybe explain what the process is. So with proxy solicitations, what we do, we file a shareowner letter with the SEC, really saying now we're going to be talking to share owners and asking them to vote for a particular proposal. So we file that letter, then we engage the proxy solicitor who then sends out letters to shareholders. Typically, we go as deep as anyone holding 20,000 shares of any particular company. That allows us to cover about 90% of the shareholding of a company. So we send letters through a proxy solicitor explaining why we think the particular issue, why they should vote in a certain way on a particular issue. And we then also try and talk to some of the larger shareholders in terms of those companies we were running solicitations. So it's both letter writing in terms of trying to reach as many of the shareholders as possible, but also there's an element of engagement because we could engage with the company and explaining also why that we think that's the right thing to do.
And that's with the larger shareholders.
We engage with the large shareholders.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you. You answered a bunch of my questions. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Yee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few questions here. So the principles or the policy that we just discussed, the sexual harassment policy, disclosure principle, are those all going to be part of what we factor in terms of the activity going forward, or is it too soon to kind of make those a part of the considerations? So the revised principles in terms of how they'll factor into the shareholder solicitation? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's since the policy hasn't been adopted yet.
Yeah, okay.
And we still have some, wordsmithing to go.
All right.
This is really our proposed solicitations for this season, which are ongoing and happening, this month, next month, and the
Okay.
following month. For the following season, then that could be an area
They'll be in place.
of priority that we would collectively agree to as priorities as part of the proxy
Okay.
season setting that we do in March.
Okay, great. And then I guess just an assessment maybe as you're working with some of our partners about how successful you think the climate risk proposals will be with the clamping down of the SEC in terms of what they're couching as micromanaging as we go forth on those.
Yeah, we've seen sort of, some proposals that have failed to go through in terms of the SEC, issuing a no action letter. But I think what we've also seen is a number of companies really, especially with the successes that we saw last year, I think we're seeing companies actually being open open to settlement, especially when they know that a lot of the big share owners, including not just ourselves, but some of the big asset managers have come out publicly in support of climate risk reporting. I think in terms of what the SEC does, whether it's they issue a no action letter, that's something which really is outside of our purview. But once it's out there in terms of the voting, we would expect that if the company has not come out with climate risk disclosures along the TCFD guidelines, or at least something which is acceptable, we would expect that share owners will continue to support those proposals to the same sort of rate as probably last year, if not higher.
Just to add to a point on that, there has been a new staff approach on shareholder proposals, and one which I think on the base, looks sensible, which is that when they're doing the review process, and there's a share owner proposal, and then the company requests that it not go to the vote, they want to know if the board has discussed the proposal. Well, this is actually something really, we could only say, yes, that's a very important thing to know. Is it just the request for the no vote is, the no action letter, preventing it going to the vote is coming, say, through the legal department or public affairs, or has the board actually looked at it? So that's a good thing. At the same time, there are a couple of proposals, and I think Anadarko might be the example you're thinking of, but also one at Apple, where the staff decision was to prevent the proposal going forwards, even though it referred to, in one case, climate change. The thing that they didn't like was the fact that the proposal was calling for a specific target or a date by which certain things would happen. And that was quite a well-established view that you shouldn't be trying to micromanage. You shouldn't be getting shareholders to tell management to do specific things. So I think Apple's the 2 degrees proposals, which we've been supporting so far, have been continued to be allowed through the process.
Great.
And some other proposals which are getting into the nitty-gritty, saying we must have this emissions target by this date, those have been viewed by the staff. But actually, I think the SEC review this season has been improved by requiring the company to say whether the board of directors has actually looked at it. So that kind of, means companies have to raise their game when they're going forward to ask for a no action letter. So,
Great. Okay.
Ms. Yu, the one thing I would add to that is, I personally, when I saw this item and saw the numbers, I was very encouraged to see last year we filed 15 proposals and we got 1 settlement, right? So that's around 7% or so settled, right? This year we had 20 proposals and got 6 settlements, right? Which is around 30%. I do think that Anne's made this point in the past, and Samisa just made it, that in the wake of Exxon, we're starting to see some momentum here, and that's very, very encouraging to me. So progress won't happen as fast as we all want it to, but it seems to be happening.
Okay, thank you. So that concludes the...
This is just one item, and I'll just tee it up because I think others may want to speak to it. But you spoke last month about the voting enhancement with respect to executive compensation. And I guess what I'm still kind of bothered by is just kind of this Glass Lewis grade C kind of bunch of companies. I mean, it's a huge number. I know we're going to do some more kind of case-by-case review, and it's a lot more information that will help in terms of what will guide our vote, but including CEO pay ratio and the like. But I guess, is there some thought about another approach that might be able to get us to where we can act on these a little bit more, maybe quickly and efficiently?
We're prepared to take up this topic now, and I do think I've seen we had the suggestion last month, and we've seen the letter from Mr. Silberstein as well, and I do think it's always attractive to anchor on to a simple report card from an outside vendor and latch on to that as the holy grail. Our approach is much more detailed than that and takes into consideration a number of factors in addition to whatever report card, grade, Glass Lewis, or any other proxy solicitor would give, because the fiduciary obligation resides with us, CalPERS, both with this board and the principles that you adopt, and then as you delegate to staff, both the weighing of all of the factors in your executive compensation policy as well as factors that staff use. So maybe I'll turn it over, I think it's Samiso and Ann and Dan for comments. Samiso, you're going to take this up, what we actually do when we look through it, and probably some facts and figures about an F grade, a D grade, a C grade, and a B grade, and how even Glass Lewis votes with respect to those grades as well. So,
yeah, thank you, Ted. Samiso Nzima, Investment Director, Global Equity. So basically, as Ted indicated, really, the fiduciary duty resides with us. We retain the independence of judgment when it comes to these issues. We use multiple sources. Glass Lewis is one of them. We use Glass Lewis, we use ISS, we use Aquila, really just to take a look at these compensation plans. And when you look at the Glass Lewis pay for performance recommendation, for example, even the F rating, where they rate the performance plan as an F, they only recommend voting against that 2/3 of the time. Even for using their own model, they don't necessarily recommend voting against those plans. The same thing with the D recommendation, they only recommend voting against those 1/3 of the time. And when you look at what we actually do, because we go in, we use the Glass Lewis rating really as a way to quickly sort of identify those which may be, the worst of the worst, and we go in and look for any other features which we don't like in these plans. And based on our voting record historically, we've voted against about 18% of comp plans, which granted is not really a high number, but Glass Lewis at the same time was recommending voting against 16%. So even with the old way that we used to look at things, we're voting against at a higher level than Glass Lewis recommendation. Right. And with this new enhancement, we anticipate that at a minimum, just looking at the D and F, at a minimum would be probably voting at around 27%. And then when we look at the C-rated comp plans, that's when we'll spend additional, time going through and looking at whether it's the quantum, where they're paying a large amount on absolute basis or peer relative, or whether the performance threshold, the targets, they are not disclosed, and so forth, and vote against those plans as well. So this is really, it's something which we recognize that there's an opportunity to hold, company executives accountable for performance, and we, apart from the voting enhancement that we did, what we've committed to doing this calendar year at least is that we're going out and engaging some compensation experts in terms of trying to see whether there's a systematic way, a better systematic way of analyzing these things. Again, we're faced with 10,000 securities, voting on 10,000 securities. We have to find a systematic way that captures that pay for performance, but the systematic way that actually we have input in developing. That's why we're engaging these compensation experts to say, let's talk about this. How can we build something better, which we can take even, to management and the board and say, here are the facts. Can you refute them? This is why we are voting against you. And more than that, again, in terms of the voting that we do around this area, we would hold the compensation committee members accountable. So our vote is not just on the compensation plan. If we vote against a plan and we find that the following year the compensation committee hasn't really addressed, that the poor design of the plan, we're actually voting against compensation committee members, which I don't think Glass Lewis or anyone else does that. So really, we're looking at this from multiple angles and holding the compensation committee members accountable for the pay for performance. And as part of the research that we're doing, we're actually talking to other asset managers and asset owners in terms of what they're actually doing, how they're approaching this area. And it's interesting, as we're talking to one of the compensation experts last week, they mentioned that they were talking to another large public fund, and that's the fund we've been communicating with in trying to figure out how to address this in a more systematic way. So that's something which we really will continue to spend time and hopefully hold these companies accountable for the pay that they are issuing to management.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Finish?
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I apologize for raising this at the last item. It really is obviously at this item. And I really appreciate the last part of your comments, particularly about the complexity of doing this and that you got to have a system approach to being able to do it. Otherwise, you can you'll spend full time doing this as opposed to managing the investments themselves. That being said, you mentioned about seeking other asset owners. And my understanding is there's a fairly significant diversity in terms of how this is approached and what the actual end result voting has been with other asset owners that are somewhat comparable to us in terms of what their outlook might be. So I'm wondering, how do we, is that just a difference of view? Is it a different structure? What is it that creates this significant diversity between, say, Minnesota and Florida and CalPERS in terms of this particular issue? What would you attribute that to?
I think probably it could be an issue of the structure around the voting, because again, maybe some of the funds just adopt, maybe, for example, the Glass Lewis, where they would say if it's it's rated C and below, then they're actually going to vote against that. So that's sort of a different approach.
So less nuance and less look at other factors.
Exactly. And we want to build, at least if we're using a model, a model that we've had sort of an input and understanding in terms of how it's actually built, and a model that looks over again, long term. We talk about, we're long-term investors, and when you look at some of the models out there, they're looking at 3 years, and 3 years for us is not long-term. So again, we're looking at this, again, coming in with trying to match sort of our long-term horizon when we're talking about pay for performance, as opposed just to adopting an off-the-shelf, which may not address some of the nuances that really underpin this important issue.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, we certainly know Florida and Minnesota well, their CIOs well. We can, as part of this consultation, we can reach out to them and get a little more flavor as to what they're doing.
Okay, thank you. We do have a request to speak on this item 6C, Mr. Al Darby and Mr. Steve Silverstein. If you will come up to my left and your right, the mics will be on, and you will have 3 minutes to speak, and the clock will start once you start speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board. Thank you for allowing me to speak. As you know, I did speak on this last month. The bottom line here is the board has a fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries and to the local governments to not waste money. What's happened with CEO pay is it's gone totally out of control. It's an expense that is detracting from the returns. Now, Glass Lewis does not have a fiduciary responsibility. They rate these packages and they tell you this one is too high, it's not really tied to performance, and they give it an F. But they don't have any fiduciary responsibility to vote it one way or another. You do. And what they're telling you in their ratings is a lot of these pay packages, the pay is too high, it's going out of control, and it's not really tied to performance. There have been numerous academic studies. Here's one from a Harvard professor, Pay Without Performance, that shows overall there is no tie between performance and pay. We just had a case here. This CEO of Wells Fargo just got a 36% pay increase from $12 million a year to almost $18 million. And the performance of Wells Fargo compared to its peers has been terrible. That's what's going on. And unless you vote against this, you're basically signing your own execution warrant here. If these trends continue, these pay is going to just go up and up and up, and it's not tied to performance. Now, there are some other pension funds, Minnesota, Florida, the province of Alberta, European ones, that have no problem voting no here. And you need to do that to send a signal that this kind of hand in the till that's been going on in too many companies needs to stop, and that CalPERS is speaking up like some of these other pension funds are in doing this. It's not that hard to do. So unless you're voting like those guys are doing, voting against at least half of these, you're not really doing your job. Now, I am pleased to see that with the changes proposed here, we're going to be voting against about a quarter of these. That's a big improvement from where we've been, but we need to go further. So I hope that you will direct the staff to look at this and see if they can get their record up to be among the best practices of other pension funds in this area. Certainly your beneficiaries and your local governments will appreciate this. Thank you.
Good, thank you for your comments. Mr. Darby?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. RPEA certainly supports these corporate governance provisions that you're putting forth here. But while RPA retains its position that ESG and divestiture should take a back seat to equities with superior investment returns, that will move the PERF to 80% or better funded status. RPEA believes that the S part of ESG and or the corporate governance policy you adopt should encompass income inequality as a much bigger, higher profile component. The current employee compensation section in your proposal here is weak on income inequality. A very recent report indicates that the 2017 tax cut has not translated to the $4,000 to $9,000 average increase in middle-class income as it was advertised to do. For a family that gets an income, the average median income is $54,000 to $60,000, something in that range. They're not seeing this $4,000 to $9,000 increase. Right now, they've identified only $6.34 of the increase they were supposed to get from this additional tax cut and corporate corporate income increases and bonuses. Instead, the corporations are busy buying back stock and increasing dividend payouts. CalPERS recently announced that over 60% of CalPERS recipients only receive $36,000 or less. Just the other day, it was announced that in Sacramento, a two-bedroom apartment costs about $2,000 a month. So this is not an adequate income, particularly for those who do not receive Social Security. This highlights the need for equalization in the middle-class income structure. Income inequality should be a major focus of ESG and your corporate governance policy. ESG is a component of the investment committee, and this should be part of the overall policy there. Income inequality, or the component in the corporate governance policy that you're contemplating right now, should should strengthen that section of your corporate policy.
Mr. Darby, your time
Elon
is up.
Musk just indicated that human capital is more important than they thought it to be. He had to use humans to correct
Mr. Darby,
the
your time is up.
deficiencies of the robots. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we move to summary of committee direction.
Okay, Mr. Chair, and as usual, please follow along and to make sure we get all of them. So starting from the beginning, there's a request from the Treasurer's Office that, at some point in the future, for a consultation between CalPERS staff and RV Kuhn regarding our 2013 SIP work that was done, and we'll follow up with that. That was items 5A. On 6A, a request that to provide the committee with a breakdown of industry sectors of dual class and no vote companies. There is direction to include at the next midpoint ALM cycle, specifically in the discussion of potential exclusion of dual class, to make sure that there's a discussion and analysis of possible exclusion of no-vote shares as part of the next ALM process. I believe there is a discussion around SEC hearing content, but it was on the website, so I don't think we're providing anything. I think,
Right.
well, if there's problems with the website, let us know. Moving on to 6B. There's indication from the Treasurer's Office that a discussion around diversity at the next meeting. I think the only to-do item there is a suggestion if the Treasurer's Office could provide something in writing, then we'll circulate it to the whole board and to
Okay.
staff. There was a suggestion for us to come back with potential language tying the new language around sexual harassment to the clawback language. We'll come back with proposed language next month, as well as contemplating and bringing back new language in response to Mr. Costigan's comments around arbitration in the new sexual harassment policy. That's, I think, everything on 6B.
Yeah.
On 6C, I think the only commitment that we made, and I think was taken as board direction, is that as part of the follow-up work that Samiso and the team are doing on executive compensation, I said that we'd reach out to the state of Florida and Minnesota to get some feedback on their specificity.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one request for public comment. Mr. George Lynn, if you will come forward. And you have 3 minutes, and your mic is on, and the clock will start when you start speaking.
George Lynn, President of RPEA. Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. I kind of hate to be a broken record, and following up on some of the things that Mr. Darby spoke about, I'm concerned about return on investment. I love ESG. I think that the governance side has a lot of merit to it. Let's take a look at our own board and see how we fit we members seem to have voted 3 and 3 when it comes to gender. I don't know about the rest. So I think that maybe that's a consideration when we're having consideration and discussions with those that appoint others. When it comes to the social issues, you know that I've spoken before, that we need to be always looking at return on investment. Divestiture is only a item for discussion if the return on investment would not be impacted. Let's take a look at the environmental part. I think that it's great, my wife and I have been very, very much on this page since long before it was popular. Recycling and all those other kinds of things. So I'm not against it. But when we're investing in wind farms and solar farms and whatever else that may be environmental, the one thing that is missing from the public announcements is how this fits into our return on investment. The announcement in November about the wind farm acquisition, I thought was probably a very good thing, and it's a very good long-term thing, as a couple of you board members have mentioned to me, that it's a long-term kind of thing. But I'm also concerned that, we're hardly at 70%, and so we need to be taking a look at that, and we need to have transparency. If we are investing in something that is not providing the numbers to increase that, then there must be reasons. And so we can provide those reasons and logically convince those that these are the things we need to be doing. But frankly, right now, it's kind of in the dark. I thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Land. Okay, that concludes the Open Investment Committee meeting, and that meeting is adjourned. And we will convene in closed session when we return to the auditorium at 2:15.
Thank you.